Greetings, YouTube. If you live in America, you have one of four lineages. Um, you are either an indigenous, a slave, an immigrant, or a refugee. That's it. That's how you got to this continent. Um, because it was the indigenous folks that arrived here first. And some of the solid evidence I've seen recently shows that they could have been here as long as 20,000 years. So they were here a long time before the white-ass Europeans showed up, or before the white-ass Europeans started importing enslaved victims of war crimes. So yeah, that's a thing. And of course, then there are immigrants that came here from all over the planet, as well as refugees who've come from all over the planet. People fleeing violence and unrest, frequently started by the United States of America, because we're good at that. We're really good at wandering around into other people's countries with a big stick and smacking every hornet's nest we can find, and then dropping the stick and going like, what do you mean? I had nothing to do with that. When of course it was us all along. Look up the history of the word banana republic. If you don't know it, you're going to be depressed. So there's no denying that everyone here, other than the first category I mentioned, the indigenous folks, is standing on stolen land. Right now, I am sitting on land that at one time belonged to a group of indigenous people that were driven off this land by the invading Europeans. The land was actually cleared of the indigenous folks long before I showed up. Even my ancestors were here. They didn't show up till like the 19th century. We've been late 19th century. We've been here for like, I think 4 generations on one side of the family and 5 on the other. I can't quite remember exactly when they showed up. But, you know, one of my relatives did fight in the Spanish-American War. I can remember that. So don't think that you are somehow superior to anybody else in this country. Because again, you're one of those 4 categories and you're probably not the first one. I know I'm not. I don't have a drop of indigenous blood in me. I think I have more Italian blood in me than I have anything else, than I have of indigenous of any place. Yeah, I'm a very white person. Most of my lineage is from Northern Europe, you know, England, Germany, Wales, that kind of region. As you can see, I am a pasty white boy. I am the whitest white boy that ever walked out of White Town. But it is interesting to me to know who lived here before us. That's intriguing to me. I've often imagined when I'm standing outside, what did that spot look like the day before the first European showed up? Before the first European ever set foot on this continent, what did this place look like? And who were the people that lived here? Now, we know some of that because we've got the archaeological evidence. We know some of that because there are some peoples that are still here that can trace their lineage all the way back to that time. So we have a verbal history that came from that era. And we know technologically what is the most likely they were using for tools and things like that. New England was one of the last places in the world to use the atlatl, for example. But I don't ever forget that I'm standing on stolen land. And most Americans don't want to think about that. Americans don't want to think about the fact that they are the descendants, many of us at least, of colonials, of colonizers. My wife can trace her lineage all the way back to the ship that Miles Standish came on. Okay? She goes all the way back to the earliest colonists that showed up here in New England. So her family lineage are the colonizers. I just benefited from the atrocious and vile work that they had done before my family showed up. But remember, the Europeans used every method possible. They cheated, they stole, they used biological warfare, they used ordinary, everyday, conventional warfare. They just drove out the peoples that lived here, pushing them further and further west, driving them across the continent to places that they were never from. A lot of the reservations out there are peopled with indigenous folks that didn't originate in those regions. They were pushed out of their homelands completely and into the indigenous regions that were controlled by other indigenous groups, also being corralled and driven from their lands. There are some indigenous lands in New England and on the East Coast which still belong to the indigenous people, but they're also under threat constantly. And it was and is an atrocity. So I'm going to put a link below which will let you look up who lived on the land that you currently occupy. My wife sent me this link originally. I can't remember where she found it. And I find it fascinating. It's incredibly complex because a lot of these lands had overlapping groups, and a lot of that was because of seasonal movement, because a lot of them, many of them were semi-nomadic. Not all of them, but many of them were. And particularly in the zones that were going to have heavy, hard winters, people moved around a lot because sitting in one spot was going to be difficult at certain times of the year, so they moved about frequently. And I also find the whole technological necessities that they overcame, just I marvel at what they were able to accomplish with Neolithic tools. It just astounds me. Their understanding of their environment and their ability to adapt what they could find and modify with their hands and their minds is something that I will never tire of learning about. I read a great book years ago. It was called Making Silent Stones Speak, and it was about the earliest tools created by our ancestors, our ancestors prior to humanity, prior to Homo sapiens sapien, and the tools they invented and how they were used and how that technological history was passed on to us. Fascinating book. Kind of dry, still fascinating. So go follow the link and find out who used to occupy the land that you currently live on. I can guarantee you most of them are probably not occupied by the folks that originally occupied them. They're going to be occupied by really white people, such as myself, or the descendants of slaves, immigrants, or refugees of a more recent era. So it's interesting, it's informative, it's also depressing. So go check it out and tell me who lived where you do now.